Welcome to everyone for joining us tonight for our second SCMLi learning series, which we are focusing on the topic of spiritual capital. We are very, very pleased to have Professor Chris Baker join us tonight. He will be giving us our presentation. Professor Chris Baker is the William Temple Professor of Religion, Belief, and Public Life at Goldsmiths University of London. And he will be speaking to us tonight about building back better, leveraging spiritual capital towards civic and political activism in the post-pandemic era. Before I hand it over to Professor Baker, just a couple of words about how we would like to run this session. We will have a brief presentation by Professor Baker, after which we'll have a short panel discussion. We will be joined by two panelists, whom I will introduce briefly, who will engage with Professor Baker around the topic that he just presented. And then we would like to break out into some breakout groups with everybody who is participating. The idea really is for people to have an opportunity to engage around the topic that Professor Baker will be presenting, and to engage with each other, to exchange ideas, opinions, ask questions, etc. This is not intended to be a highly academic conversation, although I'm sure we're going to learn a lot. The idea is we are trying to bring the notion of spiritual capital to the forefront. We're trying to give it a broad audience. We really feel that spiritual capital is an important concept that has a lot to contribute in our society, and we're hoping that it's going to resonate with people. So in that vein, we have asked people to share with us their particular perspective, their ideas around spiritual capital, in the hope that it will resonate with people and spark interest. So with that, Professor Baker, you're still on mute, but if you can unmute yourself, I will give the floor to you and let you take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alan, very much. And good evening, everyone, or good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. It's very good to see you. Thank you for taking the time out to listen to this presentation. And thank you to SCMLi for beginning to kind of calibrate, restart the kind of discussion around spiritual capital, which has lots of different strands of engagement and research going on. I'm just setting off my stopwatch, so I'm doing for time. It's really good to be here. Now, Alan, I'm assuming I can share my screen, can I?
Yes, I'll make you a co-host for that. And then
Thank you.
Screen. Now you should be able to share your screen.
Yeah, got it. So, oops, I'm getting lots of messages of people trying to get admitted into the room. I'll just ignore those. So the title of my, Building Back Better, leveraging spiritual capital towards civic and political activism. Just a little bit about myself. I work at something called the Faith and Civil Society Unit based at Goldsmiths. We are interested in and trying to understand its impact on the public square or public squares. So how does religion and belief as it's lived out shape the public square? But also how does the public square shape and mold religion and belief? And it's very much in that kind of vein that I'm hoping to be able to offer you some thoughts today. So the argument that I'm proposing in this 20 minutes or so is to say that spiritual capital, I think, is one of those ways in which we can helps us to understand how lived religion and lived belief get into the public square, because spiritual capital is that motivating energy that our beliefs, values, and worldviews create for us, that impel us to act in certain ways in the public square. So I started talking about this 20 years ago, just after, when I got my doctorate. And I don't know, I think there was quite a lot of interest, but in many ways it felt a bit like a prophet in the wilderness. And maybe spiritual capital 20 years ago was just a little bit ahead of its time. But my thesis now, looking at the way the world is shaping up and the way in which it's going, is that what I'm calling the current zeitgeist has shifted it back into focus, or at least that's the thesis I want to share with you. And I'm going to do that in 3 stages. So I'm just going to give you my own take on spiritual capital and how it's evolved for me. Because as Alan said, many of the people in this series, if we've had one from Michael O'Sullivan already, a great presentation, there's plenty more coming up in the weeks and months ahead. Everyone has a slightly different take on spiritual capital and what it means. I'm then going to explore a little bit what I'm calling the Generation Z zeitgeist, the live your life zeitgeist. That's not to say that we're all Generation Z, but I think what I'm saying is that the way that Generation Z is approaching life does, of course, deeply reflect what's going on in our society. But in fact, it offers lessons, I think, to all of us. And to some extent, I think we're all being kind of moved into a Generation Z zeitgeist kind of space. And then if there's time, I want to see where this lands in real life, as it were. So I've got a case study of some research I'm doing at the moment, where I think spiritual capital is making an interesting reappearance more in the policy setting. So just kind of testing out where this debate is landing in the current context. So just to say a little bit about my own take on spiritual capital. I've always been very interested in particularly, I think, as the 20th century and 21st century have moved through the decades, the expectation somehow that urbanization as an expression of modernity would kind of erase the relevance of religion and spirituality, which was very much the kind of take back in the 20th century. I don't think has come to pass. Religion, belief, and urbanism go together very well. And so my first piece of research, I was interested in this idea of faith-based regeneration. So at the time, those of you in the UK under New Labour, you'll recall that urban regeneration was a key cornerstone of their policy, particularly in post-industrial cities like Manchester, where I did my research in the north of England, which had once been thriving, manufacturing cities, but had gone through several decades of decline, post-industrial decline. And I was interested in the kind of contribution that faith groups were making to this urban regeneration project, which was primarily about, erasing old communities and putting in place very iconic flagship developments and kind of postmodern developments. And not to my surprise, really, I was interested in what they were doing, but also why they were doing what they were doing. So I discovered that, of course, faith groups were providing lots of essential goods and services in these very deprived communities. They were often the kind of last institutional presence left after statutory services had been withdrawn. And they were providing all sorts of really important goods and services around, education, social care, youth work, homelessness, food poverty, that kind of thing. And, I discovered that the local authorities in Manchester, national, regional government were delighted with this contribution. But I wanted to tell the other part of the story, which was why. Why were faith groups doing this? Why were they impelled to offer so much social capital? And the short answer to that kind of conundrum was, yes, whilst the goods were welcome, the services were welcome, the motivation that was driving it, that was essential to the production of these goods and services, was not allowed to come into the policy space, was not allowed to come into the public square. So the faith motivation, the faith reasons, the theological reasons, the rationales that these faith groups were saying, this is why we do what we do. This is what drives our commitment to be engaged in our communities in such a kind of full-on way, always had to be left at the door when it came to discussions about funding partnerships in general. And this felt to them deeply unjust. This idea of having something that's so core to your identity edited out, I thought was a very powerful idea. And I suppose I'm one of the first people to say this is wrong. You can't edit out values and beliefs out of the policy space. You can't edit out people's deepest motivations, because in a way you're editing out something that's very important to them. So I needed to find something that policymakers could understand the significance of and importance of this drive, this motivation that comes from belief. So I came up with this idea of spiritual capital, sort of putting it onto the kind of social capital framework that was familiar to most people at the time. So I said that, if what religious groups create and produce in urban areas is religious capital, the goods and services that they provide, because it's a contribution to social capital, then in order to understand the resilience and power of religious capital, you need to understand the spiritual capital that's motivating it. So I came up with this definition back in 2006 with my colleague Hannah Skinner. Based on our research, we said that spiritual capital energizes religious capital. It energizes that desire to get engaged and the goods and services that are tangibly produced by providing a theological identity and worshipping tradition, but also a value system, moral vision, and a basis for faith. So the important thing to say is, it's not, when we talk about spiritual capital, we're not just talking about people's dogmatic ideas about what their religion says it is. It's the whole package. It's the way that faith groups relate to one another, the kind of the worship, the liturgy, all goes together to make a package that's extremely effective when it comes to cashing out, if you like, or freighting into the morals, into the public square, their beliefs and values. But there is a twist to this, of course, because not long after I started doing this research, there was the big tectonic shift in the landscape of religion and belief in the UK, and indeed the West generally, was the rise of what people called the nuns, the NONES, the people who don't identify with a religious or don't affiliate with a religious tradition. And so some work began to take place. So, who are these nuns? What drives them? What motivates them? And it's become more and more apparent as time has gone on, and more research has been done on those who don't subscribe to a religious affiliation. The no religion category isn't kind of suggesting there's an empty vessel there or there's a lack of something, but actually there's actually a deep, rich hinterland of beliefs, values, and worldviews within that identity that's focusing around trying to ask, answers to existential questions and so on and so forth. And I've just put on that slide there some evidence that shows the kind of the complexity of and the richness of the emotional and spiritual hinterland of people who define themselves as no religion. So back in 2016, for example, a YouGov poll, 20 to 40% of people who identify as no religion nevertheless believe in an afterlife, a creator, souls, ghosts, and that sort of thing. And there's endless amounts of research that show that this is no longer a binary question of the religious versus secular. It's a much more blurred category, this idea of how religion and secularism and spirituality are coming together in people's lives. And for some years, I used Habermas's idea of the post-secular public sphere to help bolster up this idea that spiritual capital is a kind of curious mixture of religious and spiritual and non-religious belief. So Jürgen Habermas in 2005 said that with the rise of religion again in the 21st century, as a geopolitical force in the world, we needed to reimagine what we'd hitherto understood to be a secular public square, to think about a post-secular public square, in which the vigorous continuation of religion in a continually secularizing environment must be reckoned with. Now, this is now, I think, past its sell-by date. I don't hear people referring much to the post-secular anymore, and it was always a very contested term. But it got the debate going about well, where's our society going? You know, where are we going as a society with this idea of religion, belief, and spirituality? And I think the usefulness of it for me was that it indicated that the barriers between religion and the secular were becoming more blurred and porous, and that both the structures and meanings of the religious and the secular are being profoundly reshaped. So it's not just religion that's being reshaped. I think our notions of the secular and secularism and secularity are also being profoundly reshaped. And this is all grist to the mill, I think, for the reemergence of spiritual capital as a key kind of indicator or a key term that we might use to begin to describe what's going on in the public sphere. So moving on now to the next part of my talk, which is to think, okay, so how is the world changing? What is happening to the world? That, if my thesis is right, is potentially bringing spiritual capital back to the fore of our discussions and our debates. And I'm reading currently a book that's just come out on Generation Z. I think it's the first kind of major study to be done on it. And here are some interesting facts about Generation Z, which probably apply to all of us, but specifically apply to Generation Z. So who are Generation Z? Well, anybody who's born after 1996. What's the key thing about the people who are born after 1996? They've lived in a totally digital world. People of my age, I think I still live in an analog world, which is why I struggle with the digital world so much. So this is the generation whose lives have been totally shaped by the digital world. And for them, offline and online worlds are totally interchangeable. I think for the purposes of our argument, the digital provides endless opportunities for self-expression, telling the story of me, and provides endless opportunities for new ways to belong to people who share your identities and your values, called fam in the vernacular. And what the book that I'm referring to describes very well, I think, is there's a huge granularity and fluidity as to how identities are constructed and indeed updated. And therefore, what holds all this fluidity and granularity together is this idea of authenticity. The key value for Generation Zers, post-millennials, whatever you want to call them, is being authentic, being true to yourself, being true to your multiple identities, having the courage, if you like, to explore new ideas of who you are and what you want to be and what you stand for. So being authentic is a kind of key trope now around our culture. And not only us claiming the right to be authentic, but to allow others that same right to similarly express and experiment, if you like, with multiple identities and beliefs and values. So the values that are supporting this authenticity and this right to, be fluid and granular in the identities that we construct for ourselves are respect, tolerance, transparency, and honesty. These are now key values that inform individual lives, and I think are increasingly, hopefully, if recent political or current political what's going on in the current political space is anything to go by. Respect, tolerance, transparency, and honesty. And the other reason that this book highlights, which I think is perhaps applicable to all of us as well, is that this rise in the interest of values and beliefs and worldviews is as a response to the existential threats that we're now facing in our society that we weren't facing 20 years ago. So the pandemic, clearly, climate emergency, all these, Black Lives Matter, fundamental issues around inequality and injustice. These are all leading to, I think, a resurgence in an interest in values, beliefs, and worldviews in our society. And Linda Woodhead, who is a professor of she's no longer a professor of sociology. She's now, I think, a professor of moral and social theology, which is interesting, at King's College London. But those of you who know Linda's work will know her as primarily, I think, as a sociologist of religion, a very, very preeminent sociologist in her field. And I exhort you to look at her 2021 Cadbury lectures, University of Birmingham, where she gives 4 lectures that are publicly available around this idea that are values the new religion. And she builds, I think, a convincing case to say that they are. Values are new sources of motivation and identity. We see values everywhere. The rainbow flag. You can't walk into a school without seeing values posted everywhere. Corporations have their values, their value statements. There's British values or American values or European values, whatever culture you're in. Save the NHS is a key kind of value and belief now. And as she explains, she thinks this is leading to the rise in culture wars, but she says really these are values wars. And the younger you are, as we've seen with the Generation Zers, to some extent the millennials, the younger you are, the more likely you are able to articulate what your personal values are. That's, I think, a key fact. So there's a seismic shift going on as well in terms of, I suppose, how we assume we will live our lives. So she's got this great, snappy kind of aphoristic way of getting to the heart of these changes. So give your life, which was primarily a Christian ethic, which survived, you could say, up into the 50s and 60s, has now been changed to live your life. Being who you're meant to be and doing what only you can do in this life. So life itself has become a value. And I think part of this kind of seismic shift from give your life to live your life has clearly been because for many, what they've witnessed is a moral fall of religion. So sexual abuse scandals, of course, not just refined to religion, but preachy, out of touch is how she characterizes what a lot of people now, particularly perhaps younger people, experience in terms of institutional religion. And I think a key insight that kind of propels that forward is this idea you can be good without being religious. So the shift of moral responsibility is moving from institutions to individuals, which is why I think spiritual capital is making a comeback again. But it's not just the values of the church that are no longer credible, but equally our faith, she says, in science and rationalism has been deeply shaken. Although she says it's a moral rather than a scientific disaffection. As we've said, live your life is about respecting and supporting others who are doing the same as you. So you tend to choose an affinity group, you tend to choose a family who share your values and beliefs and worldviews, and so on. So where's this landing? I realize I've done 20 minutes, but can I just have 5 more minutes? Is that okay? Thank you. Thank you all for bearing with me and listening. So where's this landing for me? Well, I'm currently doing some research for a group in Parliament in the UK called the All Parliamentary Party Group on Faith and Society. And they commissioned me and the unit I referred to earlier to do some research on how partnerships have developed during the pandemic. So we brought out a report last year which covered the first 6 months of the pandemic, the first lockdown basically. And reports called Keeping the Faith, Partnerships Between Faith Groups and Local Authorities During and Beyond the Pandemic. And I'll put the link to that report in the chat box when I've finished talking, because I can't multitask. And the kind of key messages that came out of that, and we did a survey of all UK local authorities, and nearly 50% replied. So this is 194 local authorities responded to our survey. 67% said they'd noticed an increase in partnership working with faith groups since the pandemic started. 91% said their experience of pandemic partnership working with faith groups was either very positive or mostly positive. And crucially, I think 76% said they expected that partnership to continue in either current or a more enhanced basis in the future. So there was a commitment to wanting to deepen this experience of partnership that had developed during the first wave of the pandemic. So I've now done I'm writing it up now at the moment. I've done now another audit, which is not a survey, but done all on interviews, which covers the next 12 months of the second and third lockdown of the pandemic. And the emphasis on food poverty and emergency food distribution that was there in the first 6 months in terms of where the partnership between local authorities and faith groups lie has shifted. It's still there, but it's shifted now to include things like mental health and physical well-being, asylum seeker, refugee integration, domestic abuse, and emergency childcare, so fostering services. These seem to be the points of coalescence between faith groups and local authorities. And now we're 12 months in, you know, that you could say the honeymoon period's over, that adrenaline rush is over. I wanted to hear from people what they thought would be the kind of way in which these partnerships could be sustained. And a lot of people who we spoke to both local authorities and faith group leaders, said deepening partnerships require a culture shift. And that culture shift was defined as no longer assuming you know what the answers to the problems are and rigidly adopting the mantle of the expert. And interestingly, someone said, I think it was a local authority interviewee, said the pandemic has acted as a permission space to practice a new way of being. And because I come from a theological background, I kind of see it as kenosis, a kind of self-emptying of privilege, and offering instead a practice of radical hospitality to new approaches, discourses, and motivations. This is the culture shift that has allowed faith groups and local authorities to come together really closely to work together during the pandemic. And the basis of this culture shift, and I'm coming to the final point now, is this idea of sharing values. So how can we practice this radical hospitality to other perspectives in order to create greater trust, mutuality, better communication? And it's about sharing values, because people who share the same values generally want the same outcomes. And part of what I've discovered is a kind of new language that's being used. So if someone was to say to me, Chris, you know, where's the evidence base for this culture shift? Well, I'll say these are the kind of words that people are now using. And I don't think they would have been using these words 10 years ago. Compassion, kindness, empathy, hope, friendship. And what was fantastically exciting from my point of view from this research was that most people said, we don't talk about money now, we only talk about money after we've talked about these things. So the financial capital now follows these agendas rather than setting the agendas. And other shared values that came out were social justice, eradication of poverty and inequality, deep respect for all, respective of ethnic or religious background, and ethos of service to all. And one cabinet member, so a very high up member of a local authority in the West Midlands, I mean, I think I can say with confidence, it was Birmingham, which is a very, very diverse city, lots and lots of faith communities, said, we as a council are happy to work with theological ideas when it comes to the contributing debates about how do we address social poverty, how do we address social justice? Because, he says, our interests are aligned, because we are both angered, both faith groups and secular groups, if that's the right word to use, are both angered by poverty and disadvantages, and we want to break down barriers for communities and individuals in our cities. So theological ideas help that discourse be expressed, articulated, and then implemented. And a national policy advisor for the government I spoke to said, as far as you can generalize, I think it's fair to say this is nearly my concluding point. Local authorities recognize the power of faith-based organizations to make a difference, to try and find ways, by and large, to use this kind of social spiritual capital and join it in some ways to financial and building capital with all kinds of government structures. So there's a kind of holistic model of capital that's emerging at the highest levels, I would say, of at least local authority and possibly national government. We should wait to see on that. So where's this landing? So my final concluding thoughts, bringing all those ideas together. I started off by saying that spiritual capital maybe was a bit ahead of its time, and when some of us were first starting to talk about it 20 years ago. But I think it captured well that breaking down that we've been the last 20 years, of that rigid distinction between the religious and the secular, the post-secular. But and this is an open question I'd like you to explore, has interest in spiritual capital been rekindled by the digital revolution and the Generation Z, although I think it's for all of us, the search for authentic identities by which to live our lives, find our families, and allow others to do the same. Authentic identities need clearly articulated beliefs, values, and worldviews, otherwise known as spiritual capital. And then the other thing that's driving this reemergence of spiritual capital, I think, is the wider search for deep values and beliefs in response to existential threats like climate emergency, the pandemic. Jill, you'll hear less in a little while, the work she's doing. Another one of my PhD students is looking at Extinction Rebellion and noticing how faith and religion and spirituality are deeply embedded in that environmental movement, whereas it wasn't. Most environmental movements up to at that time had rigidly kept religion out of the framework. So the why question rather than the what question has become important again, I would say, and editing in religion and belief rather than editing it out is becoming, I think, a new norm. But the question and the problem that's haunted me, I think, and many of my colleagues, how to define and measure the presence and impact of spiritual capital in a post-pandemic and digital world. I've gone a little over my time, but thank you very much for listening, and I'll stop sharing.